That will bring us to our next speaker, Louise van Schaik, who is with the Clingendael Institute, which is actually an institute in the Netherlands. Well, how shall I describe it? In policy making and also negotiations between governments and policies. And you are also looking at the EU policies on the global challenges. So we now move from the individual back to the global problems.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, I work at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Clingendael, which is a think tank, independent, non-partisan think tank. But we work a lot for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, but also for other ministries. I was in a meeting of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment just this afternoon on the international climate change negotiations process. And this is also the topic that I will talk about this evening. Please, if you have small, let's say, clarifying questions during my presentations, don't hesitate just to ask. So I will talk about the international politics of climate change, and I hope to end a little bit on how this international politics of climate change has also contributed to transformation processes in society. So how did this political circus, you could almost call it, contribute to what's happening on the ground and the mindsets of people and so on and so forth. And I hope also that we can talk about it after the presentations, because I think it could link up some of the presentations given. Okay, so let's see how this works. Yes. So the outline of the presentation, very briefly. First, I have a few slides on climate science and threats, then the position of the key players, meaning the blocs, the states in the negotiations. What is this UN climate process and what were key points in time? What are lessons we can learn for the broader system of international relations out of these negotiations? And what is the contribution of this UN climate process to transformation processes in society? So, very briefly, the most recent findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the gathering of scientists who make overview reports on used scientific findings. Sometimes contested. I'm not a climate scientist, I'm not a meteorologist, I'm a political scientist, so I just take this for granted, since our political leaders in Europe do this as well. If you read the IPCC, you can see that they expect, that they say that we already saw 0.85 degrees increase of Celsius in the period 1880-2012. So this is basically when the industrialization began in our part of the world. And they expect that we will, if we do business as usual, exceed this 2 degrees target. They say temperature should not rise above 2 degrees target in comparison to pre-industrial levels, because then this will set in motion all kinds of risks and dangerous processes which we don't want. That's a political statement. On sea level rise, relevance for the Netherlands, we already saw 19 centimeters. I think what many people in the Netherlands don't realize is that we already pay a lot now for the increased estimates of sea level rise that are incorporated in the regular infrastructure, water defense systems. But this is expected to more than double in 2100. Well, you can expect a country like the Netherlands, where many people live here in the delta, that we can pay for that. But what happens in Bangladesh or other delta areas in the world? And we see this trend of urbanization, but what we also see is that we see a trend also towards people living in deltas. So what we also see is more extreme weather events. And what they also say is, well, still human influence on the climate system is clear. So it's not, let's say, that a volcano erupts and that we have climate change, but it's really man-made greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a picture. This is basically if we do nothing, and then if we really stop estimating greenhouse gas emissions, we could arrive at the 1.5 increase of Celsius. So that's the scenarios that we give. So just a very overview what could happen. I call it threats and risks, but perhaps I should emphasize that there may also be opportunities arising out of this climate change agenda. It's not all doom and gloom. For instance, new parts in the world that become suitable for agricultural production, wine production in the Netherlands. Well,
that will save the world.
yeah. So, but in any case, extreme frequency and severity of extreme weather events, pressure on food production and water supply. We already see that scarcity of fresh water, access to drinking water is an increasing problem. So far there's not really hard evidence that this causes conflicts in the world, but you see that there is a large overlap between areas where food and water are scarce and where tensions or political tensions or conflicts are emerging. And for food you can really see that higher food prices, especially in cities, can cause food riots. Then, of course, environmental migration. Well, usually people don't move overnight. Well, if there's a natural disaster, they may move overnight, but usually they don't. But the people that can, that usually move out of areas that become too dry or where groundwater levels come up, things like this. Then the Arctic region, the melting of the ice caps. Well, that also causes extra sea level rise. But there you see also some opportunities. There can be access to oil and minerals in the Arctic region, and also sea lanes. It's much quicker to go from Rotterdam to China if you can, if the North Pole opens up, basically. But here you also see extreme risk for tensions with Russia and Canada disputing access on these areas which may open up and have access to the minerals and oil in the ground. And this is already, Putin has already made statements about this. They have already planted the flag on the ground of contested areas. This is really something which could come up in the near future. Increased spread of diseases because of the temperature changes. Well, a direct threat for people on low-lying islands. Imagine that you live on Tuvalu. There's just nowhere they can go. So that will also put pressure on the security architecture and on the international rule-based system. Really discussions about equity. What do we do with people on the low-lying islands? Do we compensate people in these developed countries who suffer most from the consequences of climate change and so on and so forth? So, just to give you an idea on where these emissions come from, this is from the International Energy Agency. This was 1990, 2005, and this is two different scenarios for 2030. And then you see that basically the share of the EU, still 20% in 1990, in 2030 it's only 10%. And China, of course, having become the biggest emitter by now. But that's basically because everything they produce for our markets is causing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And they have huge trouble now, of course, in China with the local pollution also caused by this process of industrialization. But still, this is the level of greenhouse gas emissions per capita. I think this is from 2009, so it's maybe should be probably a little bit higher for China. But you can still see a big difference between the CO2 per capita in the US still being much, much higher than even Russia and the EU. Russia is entirely energy inefficient. And probably India is somewhere here. India is negligible, the emissions of the average Indian person. But yeah, the Chinese are rapidly catching up, so, but still there is a considerable difference. So, in these international climate negotiations, I will tell a little bit about the international climate change later on, but I thought it was interesting perhaps to start with what is the position of these key players. Well, the US in general is, well, first of all, the debate in the US on climate change is very polarized. It's very politicized. It's the IPCC findings are contested. and there is a big fear that climate change may hurt the competitiveness of the US economy, especially when the Chinese and the Indians are not taking up also commitment to fight climate change. But also there is a reluctance to commit at the international level. Here in Europe we think it's, we are strong believers in the system of multilateral cooperation, the UN system, but in the US there's much more skepticism about the idea of finding an international multilateral agreements to global issue. So the US is, they have also not ratified the Kyoto Protocol, they withdrew from this treaty. But still, they're still not very much willing to. This is not to say that nothing is happening. I mean, again, on the ground in the US, in the States, in states such as California, but also others, there is a lot of things going on. But at the top level, Obama is also pro climate change, but because the debate is so polarized, there is a lot of resistance also against this issue. Well, China in general is reluctant to engage at the international level and still refers to itself as a developing country in the context of the climate negotiations. And this is especially put forward very strongly by India, where it says we have now a right to develop, to industrialize like you did before. Basically the Brazilians are, well, perhaps a bit less on this rhetoric, but because they have also an interest in biofuels, exporting biofuels. And then we in Europe say, oh, but we don't want your biofuels when the rainforests are cut for it. And then you have a category of countries, well, like the OPEC countries, but also Sudan or Venezuela or Nigeria or Russia, that are really spoilers basically in the process. They don't want anything on the climate change agenda. Well, then you have the strong advocates that are these small island states that are literally drowning. Other states who are swing states, and I say the broader category of developing countries, least developing countries, are more or less supportive. They fear the consequences of climate change and the droughts, and they also think there is some money to gain from this agenda, so they are more or less supportive. So it's bloc negotiations, basically it's the EU, then it's the basics, that's basically the BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, but without Russia. So it's the acronym they use for the climate change negotiations. There is a G77 in China group, which is basically 133 countries. And all the challenge is really for the EU to divide these groups because they have different interests. There is upcoming economies, there is least developed countries, different regions in the world. But when they stick together, it's really north-south, and then the negotiations are completely locked. And one of the attempts to split the group is really the Cartagena dialogue or alliance. And that's a kind of progressive alliance with states from both the developing countries and also the Australia and the EU countries. The Netherlands is also involved in this. Well, and then the low-lying islands, the African countries, and the Latins. So, but I want to emphasize, in this climate change circus, there is also a huge number of other actors who are operating or are participating in it. There is the UN Secretariat and all kinds of UN agencies, UN Development Programme, Environment Programme. There is the IPCC with the scientific finance. There is the Global Environment Facility. There's all kinds of international organizations. There's also a role for the G20. But especially there is a huge role for all kinds of business groups, NGOs. So these UN climate summits, it's not only negotiations between states, it's also, as you could call it, a big PR event for the issue of climate change. And it's also a lot of people meeting each other and organizing what is called side events. And exchanging information on climate change. I think as such, it depends really, but I believe the Copenhagen summit was more than 100,000
itself.
Yeah, it's really huge.
for the
Now it's
government.
probably 8,000 or so, the smaller ones, 8 to 20. But it's really it's really huge numbers, and you know the business. There is some complaints that the different groups don't interact enough at these summits. You know, the business are in their own hotel lobby, organizing their own carbon market events. The NGOs are protesting on the beach. And the government officials are just in meeting rooms in their subcommittees of ad hoc agenda item, discussing, you know, these smaller issues. Yeah, but it's a meeting where it's a circus where the people meet. Okay. So this is in the context of the UNFCCC, UNFCCC as the Brits say, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is both a treaty but it's also the platform in which these negotiations take place. And it also sets out some principles, and each year there's conferences of the parties to this UNFCCC meetings, and that's basically the UN Climate Summit. The Kyoto Protocol was negotiated within these UNFCCC meetings, with the first commitment period until 2012, and now it runs until 2020. So the focus is now really on what's happening after. And basically a flaw with the Kyoto Protocol is that it only has emission reductions for a few, the happy few, the rich countries without the US basically. And nowadays it's basically only the EU states and well, a few others, I think Kazakhstan, Switzerland, Norway, just a few others. So in 2009 we saw this big Copenhagen summit, but it was not a success. There was not a new treaty, and there you could really see. That's what I would say. Lessons, IR implications. You could really see a shift towards the multipolar world, and really China and the US. Calling the shots, the big role for the basics in the economy. EU still says that they influence the outcome of this summit, but we know from all the things that leaked, the tapes and so on, that it was really the basics that had a strong role in this summit. And that puts questions on really on whether we can still continue with the way we think the international system and the multilateral rule-based system should operate according to how we do it inside the EU. So now we're looking towards Paris, and the idea in the end of Paris is to have a new big UN climate summit. Already in September, Ban Ki-moon has invited all the political leaders, Rutte will also be going there, our Prime Minister, to come to New York for a kind of political session, and this all should lead in the end of 2015 to a new treaty. But the big challenge there is that the positions of the key players are basically still the same. So there's a big reluctance of the US and China to sign up to something which is really a treaty legally binding with emission reduction commitments and so on and so forth. And the other big challenge is how to incorporate, let's say, all the transformations that are ongoing in society into this summit, and to kind of codify or lock in intentions. I like to call it the private sector, good intentions of the private sector, of cities and so on and so forth, on the issue of emission reductions, on a rise of renewable energy and so on and so forth. How to let's say codify this and to make it more hard, because that's eventually what people here in Europe want. And the question is really, is this possible? Can this be done? How can this be done? And so on and so forth. So I would say overall assessment of this whole climate negotiations is that the environmental effectiveness of the Kyoto Protocol is very weak, because the US never ratified. Dangerous climate change is inside. If we see what we are at now, it's towards a 4 or 5 degrees increase of temperature. Prospects of a future deal in terms of a real hard treaty with emission reduction commitments for each country are still very slim. But at the same time, so we see an increased pressure on natural resources, climate risks, more on loss and damages of climate change and who is responsible for that. I would say the attention for climate change resulting from this international negotiations process has really increased knowledge on climate change issues, inspired innovation, and stimulated in that way also transformation. Politics in the end of the day is about emotions. It's not only about rational short-term interests. If you only think about short-term interests, climate change is in the end of the day a costly affair, and if the others don't move, why should you? But climate change is politically also an appealing topic. So I believe that progress in the end of the day will be made, but it's going at a very slow pace, and perhaps the developments, the transformations in society are, let's say, going more rapid than what we see on top. Okay, thank you very much.